Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening, shalom, goeienaand, and welcome to the, is this the fourth episode now of Liberty and Friends? That's right, Liberty and Friends, your Sunday evening wrap-up show here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Welcome to it, everybody. You've got to have to forgive me this evening. I am back on the road, which means you'll see a lot more broadcasts from inside my vehicle. I hope the sound is pashash, and I'm just going to give it a minute for people to hop onto the stream. I know it might be a bit slow in the first few minutes, because I'm pretty sure everybody's watching a one Cyril Ramaphosa, the squirrel, wax lyrical about likely dropping the alert level, that nonsense of a lockdown. So we're going to let people watch that and hop onto the stream a little later. I have a bumper guest list tonight, a guest panel of some of the most eminent economic minds and analysts, in the country. Before I get to that, a reminder to you that you can support the show, the work that I do, by contributing, of course, monthly, as little as 20 Rand per month, guys, to the various means which are in the descriptor of the video. So please check that out when you have a moment. With that being said, without further ado, a reminder that this week the dominating issue really was the budget speech that was delivered by the Minister of Finance, that is a one Tito roast a chicken with extra garlic Mboweni, who delivered the finance or the budget speech for the 2021-2022 financial year. Am I getting that right? Yes. And lots in it. And I'm going to introduce my guest panel right now to help us firstly break the speech down, but also answer the question, what is this budget speech? What did the budget by the state mean for you, the ordinary faith, flag, family and freedom type South African? Should you be worried at the state of our financial affairs insofar as the state and the growing spending by government? If you watched my previous vlog, I gave you my initial thoughts as to what I considered to be problematic in that speech. Spending and the almost runaway and reckless spending, in my view, being the major issue, because the debt is ballooning and someone has to pay it back. So I'm going to put these issues and more to my guest panel. And speaking about my guest panel as I bring them on, I'm just going to begin from the account that I see closest to me. That is Mpiyakhe Dhlamini. Mpiyakhe, welcome to the stream. Mpiyakhe, of course, is an independent analyst and someone who is a regular here on the BDL show. Mpiyakhe, good evening.
Hi, Schussler. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent, brother. Good to have you. And of course, immediately to technically my right is Dawie Roodt. Dawie, good evening to you. You are on Liberty and Friends. Hello.
I am indeed. Good evening to you, gentlemen. A wonderful honor for me to join the stage with the two of you.
Excellent. Dawie Roodt, of course, is the chief economist at the Efficient Group. Those are the fellas out in Pretoria, in that part of the world. And I'm going to bring on Bheki Mahlobo, of course, who is an analyst at the Center for Risk and Analysis. Bheki, good evening and welcome to Liberty and Friends.
Hi, Schussler. Thanks for having me on, man. It's my first time. Glad to be here. Hi, Mpiyakhe. Hi, Dawie.
How's it, Bheki?
And last but definitely not least, a face who's also been on the BDL show quite a while back. Good to have him back. That's, of course, Mr. Mike Schussler. Mike, good evening.
Good evening, Big Daddy, and Mpiyakhe, Dawie, Bheki.
Hello, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Fellas, good evening to you. Mike Schussler, of course, is a renowned economist here in the country, one of the leading economists at the economist.co.za. And of course, he's just recently joined, is it Brenthurst? Mike?
Yes, our company has an agreement with Brenthurst Wealth Management, and we provide economic advice to them, and we've got a hopefully good relationship ahead of us.
Fantastic, fantastic. Fellas, welcome to it. Mpiyakhe, I'm just going to ask you again to lower your camera and move. You should move to your left so that you're fully in frame. Right, everybody else is totally fine. Dawie, we lost you there for a second, but there you are back. Fellas, let me hop straight into it. And, I think the first question the average South African had in their minds as they listened to what I believe is the gobbledygook at times of the budget speech is, what does this mean for me, the ordinary South African? Are my savings safe? Is my salary going to go that bit further or that less further in the next financial year? Dawie, I'm going to begin with you. What is the state of the South African economy really and government finances?
Well, actually, I think the budget goes to the heart of a democracy. I believe that every South African should really pay a lot of attention on what's going on in the budget, because the budget basically tells us where the Minister of Finance is going to get his money from, and it tells us what he's going to do with his money. It also tells us how much money he's going to borrow on your behalf, and he's been borrowing a lot of money on your behalf. All South Africans will be affected by this. If you touch money somewhere, you will be paying taxes, for example. If you leave your house, in fact, you don't even really have to leave your house, and government's going to touch you inside your house by way of electricity or water. If you leave your house, you will be affected by government, by the potholes or the roads or not, or whatever. So government is everywhere. Government is the single biggest player in the South African economy, and I think that's why we vote. I think, firstly, we vote for a political party that gives us a proper financial management of the state's affairs. And I'm afraid this government has been really failing us. So every South African must know that the South African budget, or the budget of the Minister of Finance, is, I would argue, the single most important financial happening. In fact, the single most important political happening every year.
Absolutely. And guys, Dawie introduces a very interesting concept here of the idea that the state, especially given its size now, is one of the most dominating players, if you will, in the economy. Whether you believe, if you're on the left, for example, that it should be, and perhaps should be even larger, or whether you're on the sort of liberty side of the spectrum economically, where you believe, no, actually, it's ordinary folk who should be the greatest influence in the economy. Some mind-boggling numbers, therefore, guys, and I'm going to look to you, Mike, for comment, and I'll come to you, Mpiyakhe, after that. The projections made by the minister in the speech is that, for instance, the growth of the country, that's the real GDP, he argues, is expected to grow by 3.3% this year, that's 2021, tapering off, as he put it, as I get my lighting back on here, tapering off to 2.2% in 2022, and of course, 1.6%. Mike, these are not growth numbers that inspire hope of more jobs and a booming economy.
No, not at all. Look, this year's growth, I think he's a bit conservative with, but it's the comma points, and economists can argue comma points. The point is the world economy is going to grow roughly about 5%, and, we're far behind that. The other thing I just want to point out, it's not just about growth and so on. But if you look at South Africa, the other way it influences us, every average family in South Africa, on average, would have 102,000 rands worth of loans, debt that they owe someone.
Sure.
That's on their behalf. Government, on our behalf, for the average family, owes 218,000 rand. Then if you add the state-owned enterprises, it becomes, and the government guarantees, it becomes closer to 270,000.
Sure.
Governments instituted debt counselling for South African citizens.
Sure.
I think it is in need of debt counselling quite seriously. And, I would suggest that we form a debt counselling company, and we go to them and we tell them what they can and cannot spend on. Let's see what happens, and as Dawie says, it is a democracy. That's what governments do, and it's not quite the same, but that just puts the thing into perspective. The other thing, Dawie and the other guys here would have known this, but our general government, that is government outside of the state-owned enterprises, and just point that out, but it then includes like the local municipalities, it includes agencies like PRASA and ICASA and so on, has gone from 21.7% to 43.2% in 2019. And why am I using 2019? Well, worldwide, those figures are available. And second of all, it's before the pandemic, which would have made things a bit different. Some countries would have been hit harder on their GDP. But that's a doubling in the size of government. And most of that doubling happened in the last decade. And that's huge. You
Absolutely.
know, that eats up a lot of money and a lot of resources. And we actually need more resources to change this economy. And it would be, for me, the best thing to see that closing. And I think, Mr. Mboweni pointed out the HIPPO's mouth, and he was pointing out the difference between revenue and spending. But I think the bigger part is the spending part. Yeah, and I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. And Mpiyakhe, as I said, I will come to you. There's 2 points Mike makes here, and I think I want you to jump onto them. The continuing growing of the states, the continuing growing of the size of the state, and the spending, which almost looks, again, maybe it's hyperbole from me, but it does come across as almost slightly being runaway spending insofar as the commitments the state continues to make. Government's borrowing, as the finance minister put it, will remain at above 500 billion rand per year in the MTF period, with gross loan debt increasing to 5.2 trillion rand. Mpiyakhe, where's this money coming from?
So I would like to agree with you about one point. Even though the framework itself may have improved slightly because the tax, the revenue collected was improved. But over there's still this issue that when you're dealing with such large numbers, there's an inherent risk because the numbers are so large that when you're trying to execute the reforms, the fiscal reforms, any small thing can blow you off track. So it could be an SOE or something else. So that's the main problem I see now, because I think the intentions from the minister are actually good, but I think it might not be totally in his control. A lot of it is simply political. Because it's not clear to me that you'll be able to cut wages or freeze wages for public sector employees, for example. So we'll see.
Bheki, this raises an important point. You guys did some work on this quite recently. The spending seems, as I maybe put it, maybe I am being hyperbolic, to be slightly, almost at a runaway level here. But talk to me about, this notion, before I really go into some of the meat and potatoes and really the broader overview here. Talk to me about some of the work you guys have done in this particular area. I mean, the minister basically mentions, and I want you to talk to this particular point, that the Treasury estimates that it's on track to return to a budget surplus. I find that slightly laughable, but they say they're on track to return to a budget surplus in the year 2024-25, after which the debt is expected to stabilize at 88.9% of GDP by 2026. Now, let's bear in mind that it's not a couple of years ago. Mike, I see your hand there. I don't know if you're frozen, but I do see your hand. But, it wasn't just a couple of years ago where our debt was at 60% of GDP. Can I just get Bheki to quickly chip in? Yeah. And then I'll come to you, Mike.
Yeah, Sisha, that's actually quite worrying. In fact, there's not much quite backing to Treasury figures. I mean, over the past decades, when we look at the figures that they project for economic growth, they tend to be off by a margin of 50%. And there are 3 periods in which South Africa went through periods of massive deficit levels, which is how much does the government take in revenue subtracted by expenditure as the size of the economy. And the first time that we saw such massive amounts of deficit levels was in the First World War, and the second time in the Second World War, and the third time during apartheid. And this is quite telling, unfortunately. And we added about 20% to our debt last year. And the consequences of that is quite grave for future generations, because that debt would need to be paid off by way of increasing taxes or just simply inflating it away through money printing. So it is extremely unfortunate that what essentially is happening right now is that the government's adding towards our debt, which has grave consequences.
Yeah. Mike?
I just wanted to make a slight technical thing. It's a primary deficit that will turn into a primary surplus. The
Right.
government will actually still have a budget deficit. So all that it means is that excluding debt service costs, it will be positive. So we'll have enough
Right.
money from taxes and other revenue to pull some. But it is a very optimistic situation. And as the other guests have pointed out, quite clearly it hinges mainly on the government salary freeze, wage freeze, for 2 more years, I think. And that is going to be tricky. And then obviously we've seen recently interest rates move up around the world, long bonds, and that will have an impact on your debt service costs over time. It takes time, but that could also unhinge it depending on how that moves. Those are, things that Dawie and the others can maybe better predict than me. But the point is that is the other thing. So it's the wages and the interest rates, how they will move.
Absolutely. Guys, just if you can give me a moment here. If you've just joined us, you are watching Liberty and Friends, your Sunday evening wrap-up show. We're talking all things Budget Speech 2021 with a fantastic panel. I've got, of course, Mike Schussler, economist at economist.co.za, and of course at the Brenthurst group. Welcome to him. I've got Bheki Mahlobo, who is an analyst and an economist at the Center for Risk Analysis. And last but not least, independent analyst Mpiyakhe Dhlamini. If you're wondering where Roodt has disappeared to, he is having connectivity issues, and we'll try and reestablish him on the show in a moment. Fellas, there was a lot of talk, therefore, after the speech, and I often say that there are these weird sycophants, who love praising the government and who love finding silver linings in everything that the state says, who immediately, fellas, who immediately went on to this almost at rote type praising, saying, it's a great speech, they said, because the taxes didn't go up. In fact, not only didn't the tax go up, one writer says, he even dropped corporate tax by a single %. This is the sort of thing we should be praising and worshipping, they effectively suggest. But Mike, I don't know about you, but it just seems like these are just not the sort of reforms, that just go far enough. Am I being too pessimistic?
No, you are being realistic. I mean, there's the problem is that South Africa, whilst your tax rate might not be the highest in the world, the fact is the way we collect corporate taxes and what we give off on them, we are the 7th highest corporate tax to GDP. With other words, corporate dividends are very, very high, or not dividend, tax rate. And then the personal income tax rate's the 10th highest in the world. That is 53rd highest out of 103 countries. But I've got data on 151 countries. And we must remember that particularly oil producers don't have GST or VAT.
Yeah.
So we've got to be a little bit careful how we compare all these things. But apples for apples, I've got 196 countries that I can compare with. If I leave out small countries like islands with 13,000 people and so on, then, I'll say above 750,000 people, say, at least in a country, then we have the 10th highest tax burden in the world. That's huge. For a developing country, that's very big. And the only developing countries ahead of us are those that we pay a lot of our taxes to, Namibia and Lesotho, and around us, Eswatini and Botswana. Botswana are less, but they're still in the top 30. So it is a very big burden. The cutting by 1%, the devil will be in the detail. It depends on what you do. I think the trend corporate tax-wise is really to below 21%. So I think we should take it to that level, first of all. And I think after that, we must make it known we're going to 14%. Obviously, it's politically difficult because you've told people these companies are rich and everything like that. And now that changes the whole mindset of people, and that's difficult to change. The other thing is that our civil servants' salaries are huge. They are well inside the top 10. I don't know which number, but in the emerging market, they are number 2. And guess who's ahead of us? Namibia. And we pay 55% of Namibia's tax via the customs union agreement.
That's crazy.
So it is crazy. And Lesotho is also very high. So ultimately, you know, most of our money also goes to paying those 2 countries' civil servants. It's very, very high. So I think, you know, are we getting value? Mr. Manuel brought it down to just under 9%. I would suggest that was, you know, already the top end of what we should be. So we need to bring that down, that total wage bill, from 15.2%, which is high. You know, even, let's put it this way, France, Sweden, Norway, all these sort of social democratic countries, if you wish, have far lower salaries. I mean, Sweden is 2% less than us on a GDP scale. We can go and look at other countries. You know, Nigeria is at 2%. I'm not saying we should be Nigeria. I'm just saying, you know, when we point fingers at other countries, we must remember where they are and what services they deliver. You know, I'm not saying their services are necessarily better, but what I'm saying is if I'm paying this much for my civil servants, then I wonder why I don't have 14 kids in a classroom, but a kid in a black area, to put it very bluntly, is going to have 40 kids in a classroom. But I'm paying taxes as if there are only 14 kids in a classroom. You know, it boggles the mind. It really does. And that's a worry.
Bheki, I must bring you in because there's a nice question here by Gerrit Oosthuizen, and he's saying, you know, is there really any economic value in the continuous spending of tax money to SOEs, state-owned businesses such as SAA or Denel or even Eskom? You know, Mpiyakhe, there's this almost weird trap that the political elites have placed themselves in this country of, on the one hand, insisting that these state-owned enterprises are part of a developmental program, they'll tell us, but on the other, running these same entities running at crazy losses and effectively draining public money.
Yeah. So yeah, it's taken them out a long time ago. But some of them, it's actually become too late. It's going to cost the government no matter what they do from now. Like Eskom, for example, it's going to be a cost no matter what. So for some of them, they just have to bite the cost. SAA is another similar one. So it's but they just need to make sure that their liabilities, what should be the goal right now is to make sure that the liability no longer exists into the future, which would mean getting rid of those assets or putting enough distance by bringing, let's say, majority private equity partners into these businesses and then government playing a minority role. That would be a way to do it. So just to make sure that the country is no longer liable to this for these assets going to the future. We reduce that risk to the fiscals. But I doubt that will happen because I think there are too many people invested in keeping these SOEs in the same way that we are unlikely to get a reform of the public sector wage bill, even though it's necessary. So it's just like there's nothing in the politics that hints at reform. So I don't see why reform would happen.
Absolutely. And this is the problem, isn't it, Dawie? Good to have you back. This is the problem, isn't it? We're just talking about this notion that, you know, the tax bill, the tax, burden is quite a high one in this country, where South Africans are coughing out a lot of money in order to prop up this massive state entity which continues to grow, especially through its little tentacles called state-owned enterprises. And the value for money, the bang for buck, is clearly not quite there. I mean, Mike making a good example on education, for instance. But there's a nice point made in the comment section here, you know, this notion of, you know, the taxpayer continuing to foot the bill. Surely that has a limit, Dawie.
Yeah, in fact, we can see it already on various levels. I've done a lot of work on you know, the nature on the redistributional effect, for example, on the fiscal. So the taxpayer in South Africa is overtaxed. There is very little doubt about that. And I think what we are currently seeing is a so-called Laffer effect, whereby if you increase taxes, then people are actually paying less taxes. But I can tell you from personal experience, I can tell you that people, when they walk into my office, they tell me two things. I don't want to pay tax and I want to take my money out of the country. Those are the two things that they tell me. Now, the redistribution effect of the fiscus, like I've said, is massive in South Africa. So the guys doing the paying are not the guys receiving the money. So it is, I don't know of any other a government in the world that is with the fiscus that is as redistributional as South Africa. And that creates all sort of other things. That creates all sort of other problems, because if you overtax the potential taxpayers to the extent that we are doing in South Africa, then there's literally very little money over to save. And without savings, then you can't invest, and without investment, you can't grow your economy. And on the savings point, maybe an interesting point, and Mike can elaborate on that a little bit, I guess, and I think Bheki as well. And that is, we're saving in South Africa so between 15 and 20% of GDP. That's roughly what we save. And the fiscal deficit in the current financial year is probably going to be close to that, about 15% of GDP, which means all the local available savings are gobbled up by the state. So the taxes that we pay is not enough for them. They need to borrow all the available existing savings, or just about all of that, making us exceptionally dependent on foreign capital inflows if we want to invest in South Africa. So there are some numbers there. So exceptionally redistributive, people are really aggressively structuring their tax affairs in order to pay less tax. And I'm not even talking about the inefficiency of the state. And I mean, that goes on top of all of that. But I can tell you that we cannot tax, and that is one good thing that I think that we have to give the minister credit, and that he did not increase some of the major taxes in this budget. In fact, he made a small adjustments on personal income taxes.
But fellas, there lies the sleight of hand, isn't it? In terms of I like to talk about things in a very Shakespearean sense. All of Shakespeare's work hinges around this idea of appearances versus reality. The appearance in this particular instance is that, yes, they'll tell us the taxes weren't increased. We should be happy at that. In fact, corporate taxes, as I mentioned earlier on, was, decreased by a single percent, blah, blah, blah. And the only taxes they'll tell us, the only taxes that do go up are the excise duties, on those sinners, they'll tell us. They're the only ones who pay the price, but this is simply not true. Mike, I want to come back to you, Bheki. I'll come to you after that. There is a concerted effort now, and this is where the politics comes in a little bit, but there is a concerted effort and a concerted drive by the political elites in this country to look beyond the tax pool, so to speak, and to start targeting people's savings, actually going after people's savings in one way or the other. There's various tools that they're using. I don't have to mention things like prescribed assets. In the here and now, they're talking the language of tweaking Regulation 28, for example. Should the average saver in this country, who is in the minority, by the way, and I don't mean minority in a racial sense, I mean an absolute minority, the small number of people who save sufficiently in this country, should the saver be incredibly worried when politicians start gravitating to a language of going after someone's wealth base, like savings, a pension, or anything like that?
I think, this minority is around 7 million people. That's what we know from the labor force survey, the people that save either in an RA or a pension fund. There are obviously some savers who might be in tax-free funds, but that's not a question asked, or a son. So it's an important minority, because generally it's the richer element, if you wish, in South Africa, who are not rich worldwide in any means of the imagination, but they're important for South Africa, and they want to hedge their ability to retire or do things later on with their lives or their career. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you're quite right in that prescribed assets was probably kicked down the road a bit. But it's just another form of prescribed assets, this infrastructure investment, because I'm not sure what return I'm going to get. It doesn't seem that transparent to me at the moment. And I want transparency. I want my asset manager to report something. I had a problem with an asset manager who had a property company that they put me in, and that property company was later listed, but at that stage it wasn't listed. So the price was not real. It was a book price. And I'm not saying, the only thing in life is a real market price, because quite frankly, there are market prices that way out of sync. But it at least gives me a little bit of clarity that the price moves and I can see it. and things are a lot more transparent that way. So, Sile, I really think this new way of looking for infrastructure. I know one of the things is going to help us a lot, because I do work in the transport industry, is the one-stop border at Beit Bridge.
Yeah.
And there is a way that you can get money from it. But in many of these investments that they want to do, I don't know how you're going to get money for it. And it's because the state is failing in its role as a provider of infrastructure for people that don't have means. In other words, schools, water, even electricity, if you wish. But things that people need day to day, roads, that they're trying to push it down onto our pensions, and we are not going to get the returns, or at least risk-adjusted returns at the minimum we will not get here. And I'm very concerned about that. I think many people in the asset management industry are definitely concerned about that.
Absolutely. Bheki, I must come to you because, again, we're going to get to the conversation, guys, as we sort of wrap up the conversation in a moment, around the necessary reforms and whether there was enough signals in the speech currently by the ruling elite as to whether there will be reforms in the speech. My assessment, and I want to put it to you, Bheki, is that we're actually still getting more of the same, where the speech is a great one if you're in that category of being an economic insider or the political elite. The speech was great for you. It's spending galore for you, but it's not so great if you're an ordinary citizen, the guy who works every day, breaks his back in order to build some form of a middle-class existence. Why do I say this? He then goes into that's the finance minister, into a long section in the speech where it gives away the ideology, doesn't it? Where the state, we're told, will spend billions upon billions. In fact, to put a number to it, it's actually 6.2 trillion, he argues, spending over the MTF period to fast track what they call economic reconstruction and recovery plan. Basically, the state hiring people and forming more committees to hire even more people. Bheki, are these the sort of reforms that will actually break the cycle of unemployment and a slow, sluggish economy? Should we be seeing the state do the hiring?
Short answer to that, Sisha, is no. I'll be honest, from my perspective, the budget speech didn't really offer any sense of change. To me, it felt like a copy and paste of the previous budget speeches that we have heard over the years under President Cyril Ramaphosa. So I share your sentiment to that. And that's unfortunate because we are facing economic stagnation where we're seeing low economic growth and high unemployment. Just earlier this week, we saw numbers from status-quo coming through that about 1.4 million South Africans have lost their jobs if you compare the fourth quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2019. That is unfortunate because on the average mind of the average South African, the major pressing issue for these people is, are they able to get a job to provide for their families? And if you ask a poor South African, poor, low-income, low-skilled South African, has this budget speech answered that question of you being able to provide for your family? The answer is unfortunately no. And I don't see these infrastructure programs going to that meaning any much. I don't see them going far. There's a thinking behind the ANC that these infrastructure programs will go a long mile, and the unfortunate answer to that is no. These infrastructure programs tend to go nowhere, and they end up being in the coffers of political elites and politically connected individuals.
Mpiyakhe, as I pivot to you, and guys, we're going to move this conversation towards the necessary reforms in a moment. I'm going to ask each of you to give me the top 5 reforms that you're now saying must happen. Not may, not should, the must point, as I'm hoping Tito Mboweni might be actually watching this stream. Mpiyakhe, I must finish off with you on the point of the politics and how it's ideology that's driving where we're at this moment. There is a concerted drive towards this idea that the state should be at the center of economic development. I mean, the National Development Plan speaks to this in one way or the other, of course, making a few concessions here and there. But at an actual raw political level, the ANC itself, who are in government are driven by the national democratic revolution. So we're seeing, for instance, now a move towards the capacitating of certain organs of state, which will enact this vision of the NDR. For example, the land bank, we're told, will be capacitated. This is a broke institution of state, but continues to receive funding. Lots of funding. If I'm to make the point, I've lost my place in terms of how much it got, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, these failed state institutions continuously get rewarded with more and more funding to enact this vision of the ANC of a national democratic revolution. It does beg the question, Mpiyakhe, of the moral hazard. When do we stop paying these bankrupt and continuously bankrupt state entities?
Yeah, as Bheki said, it's just a pure misallocation of resources. We have suffered for it, and as Mike and Dawie have referred to, we have actually crowded out the private sector because we have directed all our savings towards government, and those savings which have not gone to government have gone overseas, where investors have seen that the situation in the country is deteriorating, so they would rather offshore their investments and get a return there. And so there's a lot of factors that are. This is the moment to actually implement those reforms that we've been talking about. But another factor to consider is that South Africa is not actually unique when it comes to debt. Now, debt has become the norm. Every country in the world is highly indebted, corporate debts, household debts, everything, every metric you look at. And it's because of the low interest rate environment we've been under at least for the past 30 years or so. And so if you look at that situation, it means that you need a government that is willing to possibly look at a lower global growth going forward and implement the right kind of reforms that make us competitive among all the major emerging markets as well as developed economies, which means that South Africa has to stand out. And you start by what Mike and Dawie has mentioned, which is you cut spending, you start to live within your means, you don't crowd out the private sector, you allow savings to take place, investment to take place, but then you also deal with the regulatory issues. And the minister has touched on some of those, including the red tape, impact assessment bid, and so on. So we would hope to see those kinds of reforms going forward.
If you are joining us, guys, the conversation is getting to a point where I'm about to ask my guests to talk to us around, firstly, what you, the ordinary citizen, can do to protect your finances, especially as we look forward to what will rather be very rocky financial and economic times. But more than that, what we need to do as the state, society, if you will, the top 5 reforms that we need to see get into, the top 5 reforms we would like to see in this. No pressure. Mike, I'm going to begin with you. The top 5 reforms we need to see and that you'd like to see enacted by the state.
Well, I think the first thing is bring government wages back under 10% at least. Probably better to have it at 8.5%, which would save us nearly 7% of GDP. That's what I'm talking about. That will have to happen over a period of time, say 5-6 years. It's not going to be overnight. The second thing is to bring down the tax rate. And at the same time, bring down the debt burden as we start saving, or the deficit on those wages. There's also other things that we shouldn't do. Obviously, is like bailout state-owned enterprises, which you've said. But I think the fundamental thing is we need structural reform, and we need a rethink. For example, we're the only major emerging market that has a net outflow of fixed investment. And Mpiyakhe was talking about that a lot of people invest outside, or the companies do, specifically JSE companies and the bigger ones on the private side that are not even JSE listed. And they really just take more money outside of South Africa every moment they can, because of black economic empowerment, which is seen as another form of tax. And nobody wants to talk about that. And I think that and the tax rate play a role. And if you look that we're the only negative one, and we should be 25% positive to GDP, the last figures I've seen is we're negative about 40% to GDP. If we can turn that around, that is, pretty much 4 trillion rand turnaround. It won't happen overnight, but if you do that, that will change your economic growth trajectory, because people need jobs. People need an income first. Then you can talk about giving people shares and everything. If you're going to be in that sort of game, that's where I think we should be. Let's leave it there.
Absolutely. And Bheki, I must come to you, and there's a nice question that just popped up still on screen right now. Just as you think about your top 5 reforms, is there any positive predictions from the panel? But your top 5 reforms?
So my top 5 reforms are as follows. I think we need to deregulate the labor market. I think such policies such as minimum wages are very negative towards the low-skilled South African. I mean, we hear talk of structural reform within the ANC, but then when we look at the on-the-ground reality, they implement policies such as minimum wages, which is an actual barrier to low-skilled South Africans. So that's the first step that we need to look at, as well as empowerment policies, which actually do not actually help the quote-unquote, the previously disadvantaged individuals in this country, instead help the politically elite and politically connected individuals. Another thing that we need to also talk about is that the finance minister explained austerity as a sort of a slur, as a bad word. That this is the talking that we hear from most left-leaning or left-thinking governments around the world. And essentially, just to explain what austerity means, is essentially the reduction in government, in the size of government. You do not want a massive government that encroaches on the average South African, the average citizen, because that acts as an anchor on economic growth and economic activity. So my other key policy reforms would be to reduce the size of government, to implement structural reforms. But I don't suspect the ANC will do this anytime soon, because it is against the thinking of ANC to impose structural reforms. In fact, if they did so in the next week, I suspect that half of cabinet would be arrested by next week if they did structural reforms.
But Mpiyakhe raises a very good point here, and I want to also maybe talk to the politics that prevents a lot of the reforms that we've heard from Mike and Bheki, for instance. There was a question earlier on, for example, about the one viewer called the elephant in the room of expropriation without compensation. We've mentioned Black Economic Empowerment, BE, the policy as being a deterrent to investment in this country. And of course, the predatory nature of politicians now looking to eat into people's savings and pensions in order to fund their big, lofty vanity projects. As you think about your top 5 reforms, talk to us about also the need for a shift in a, let me call it an ideological outlook towards what the role of government should even be in a society like ours.
Yeah. And I think a good entry point to that is what you mentioned about the change in Regulation 28. When this was proposed, what is going to be implemented now, which would increase the allocation allowed for pension funds to invest in government-funded infrastructure. When this was first proposed, Enoch Godongwana, the Economic Transformation Committee chairperson of the ANC, he actually said that we want to implement this change so we see how the private sector responds. If the private sector doesn't invest, then we go ahead with prescribed assets. So this is more like a threat. It doesn't see fundamentally the role of government as to facilitate these things. It sees government taking a leading role. So the intention is to always have government taking the lead. So unless you have a change in that kind of thinking, even Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, as good as he is in understanding that the private sector needs to keep more of his taxes to stimulate the economy and so on, he still fundamentally believes that government spending can stimulate economic growth itself. So they still believe in this infrastructure spending, even though it has failed. It has been a failed policy. We have had multiple infrastructure plans over the past 10 years. None of them have worked, but they still persist. So it doesn't. None of it makes sense. And I think how many times do you have to be fooled until you accept that change is not going to come? And so I think we've come to that point. We have to accept as South Africans that the politics are just impossible. In terms of a positive that might happen, I won't say it's a prediction, but I think they might be, the conditions could, they look good for the possibility of another commodity bull market, another commodity cycle upwards. So yeah, that might be a good thing for South Africa if we don't squander it, of course, like the last time.
Absolutely. Dawie, I'm going to end with you. And in fact, with that being said, I do have a little bit of time, so maybe I'll open it up to the viewers also. Guys, just prepare your questions, please, for the panel as we enter the last quarter of the show. Just 15 minutes left. Dawie, your key takeaways, and then your 5 reforms that are absolutely desperately needed now.
Well, I mean, I'm last in the queue, so I mean, all my colleagues have taken all my most important reforms. But I've been thinking about this. I think when you talk about the state and government, there are 3 things that I can think of that they should do. The first one, they must spend less. The second thing is they must spend money on the right thing. And the third thing is the money that they must spend it efficiently. And they don't do that. They're not going to spend less, or much more difficult to spend less. They spend it on the wrong things, and they're certainly not very efficient in spending this money. You made a comment about the National Democratic Revolution, for example. You know, I think you give them far too much credit. Most of them, anyway. There are a couple of ideologues there. Pravin Gordhan is a very good example. He's a real communist. But I would say that the most of many, perhaps even most of government, is simply there for the ride. They don't give a sod about ideology. They simply use ideology as a selling point to be part of the ride. The ANC exists for one reason and one reason only, and that is to live off the state. That is as simple as that. And the ideological terminology that's being used is just there to sound fancy. That's all. They're not ideologues. They're a bunch of free riders, to be honest. But somebody, you asked me, there's some good news. Yes, I think here's the good news. Here's the good news. You know, I think we've got all our 5 list of 5 things that they need to do, and without a doubt, they must spend less. That is the first one on my list. But you know, they are going to spend less. I promise you, they are going to spend less. They're going to spend less because eventually we're going to run out of money. We've run out of money already. And the good news is we can see they're kicking and screaming and are really going through. I mean, why is it necessary to go through all these difficulties before you get to the realization that you have to spend less? But they're spending less on things now. They're planning to cut back on, for example, the NEL. As far as I know, the NEL didn't get money, so the NEL's probably going to be a good chance that the NEL could be liquidated, as an example. They're still giving increases to the civil servants, but less than usual, and eventually they're going to get even less. And let me make a prediction. If we continue on this road, and I think we're probably going to continue on this, we will eventually experience very, very high levels of inflation. And high inflation means that in the real terms, your spending falls, including your spending on the salaries of civil servants and politicians. So they're going to spend less. But of course, that's going to be a painful process. It would have been so much easier if they do it in a responsible manner and doing by not increasing huge salary increases in the first place. But that's the good news. The good news, and let me quote Winston Churchill, apparently, or misquote him. He said about Americans that you can always expect them to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. We've tried all the alternatives.
Absolutely. Fellas, just a quick word of warning. One of you has a background noise. If you can just make, I don't know if it sounds like plates clanging. But with that being said, I'm going to open it up for the last sort of 5 minutes of the show to the viewers. Guys, please get your questions in. I see some of them rolling in. Vernon Niger, high inflation, does this mean a Zimbabwe level of hyperinflation? That's a scary scenario, says Vernon Niger. Let me throw it to you, Mike, and then I'll throw it back to you, Dawie, in a moment. There is a conversation about the inflationary pressures as the state continues to spend in an almost wanton manner at the stage. Your inflationary outlook, Mike?
I think for this year, apart from energy and electricity, it will be rather mute because we're seeing very small increases from the medical insurance, which is big. School fees, I know from the governing body association, is really limited. They've asked people not more than 3%. So that will help. But I think, it's not just our printing of money. At the moment, the international environment is also, those governments are also trying to reinflate the economies, and which is why we're seeing a jump back in commodity prices. And I agree, that's the one good news aspect that's kept South Africa going quite well. The other thing about inflation, it gives you warning signs, I think, and we're starting to get those warning signs. It will probably bite in a year or two's time. Not quite sure when. I think timing is something that we get out quite a bit. The rand also looks a little bit stronger because of the commodity cycle at the moment, and our current account surplus says that. So even if oil prices double and the rest of our commodity prices just have a 50% increase, because we export so much more, the current account is going to remain relatively buoyant or positive. One piece of good news I don't think people always think about, but we have quarterly financial statistics. And for the non-financial private sector, excluding agriculture, I follow this quite closely. And the one amazing thing is, even during the midst of this crisis, our cash flow, in other words, if you took businesses and you left out depreciation and buying and selling of assets, after inflation, was still positive in general. Not all sectors, but in general. And albeit very small, but it also jumped back a lot in the third quarter. And I think that says to me that a lot of the private sector, because they aren't as indebted as the private sector of the emerging markets or as the government or even of the advanced countries, they have been scared for a long time, and they've been looking at different things. But that has sort of saved us. Our cash flow remained positive because with the government not bailing out businesses in South Africa much, that was necessary. Because if the cash flow went negative, that would have been a thing. Profits, sort of disappeared under the rate of inflation, but there were some profits, but it wasn't a great return. But the big thing is, if I look at the cash flow was positive above the rate of inflation. So as inflation lowered, as interest rates lowered on the little borrowings, because our private sector is 40% debt to GDP. That's what they have. A lot of that anyway, state-owned enterprises, not the private sector so much. It's just the way that it's determined by the Bank of International Settlements. And the emerging markets are 90% debt to GDP for their private sectors. Even if you leave out China, which is highly indebted, but they run a surplus with the rest of the world, that is 70%. And then advanced countries are much more, but they're richer. They can handle more. So that less debt and that our private sector has, and that our cash flow remained positive, was for me the building block of the turnaround. If we didn't have that, the turnaround wouldn't have been as buoyant.
Dawie, I'm going to come to you very briefly, and then to you, Bheki, in a moment, because there is another question I want you to add to your thoughts, Dawie. On the issue of the inflationary outlook, talk to me also about the ability to attract foreign direct investment going forward. That's a question from Gerrit Oosthuizen.
Yeah, I see Gerrit's question. Yeah, let me just get to that, and I'll get to the inflation question. We have to remember that South Africa has a very, very sophisticated, very liquid, and very well integrated financial markets, which means that capital flows in and out of South Africa very quickly. Now, if you compare South Africa to, say, Mozambique, for example, FDI is quite, Mike, help me out if I'm talking nonsense here, but quite often FDI, and relatively speaking, is much lower in South Africa than places like, for example, Mozambique. And the reason for that is easy to understand, and that is that if you want to buy into a local company in South Africa, you don't have to start it, like, for example, in Mozambique. You can simply go and buy a share in it, listed on the JSE. You can. You can't do it in Mozambique. So I think it's wrong to look at FDI only, because countries differ. And in the case of South Africa, we have a very sophisticated financial market. But coming back to
that's the portfolio flow then.
Yeah, there's not only portfolio.
Unless you go over 10%.
If you go over 10%, yes, for example, as well. But the point still remains that if you want to start a certain factory in Mozambique, if you want to invest in something, you have to. It must be FDI in most cases. And so, in the case of South Africa, it can be something else. That's the point to make. But having said that, FDI, I'm not very bullish about FDI in South Africa. I think mostly portfolio flows, and that's what we're currently seeing as well. Coming back to the inflation question, Inflation, actually, we should have a full hour on inflation. Inflation is a wonderful topic. And the thing is about inflation usually has got a spark. Remember, inflation is never it's never an event. The increase in oil price is not inflationary. The increase in food prices is not inflationary. It is only inflationary if it starts a process. Inflation is always a process. And inflation always needs fuel. And the fuel for inflation is money. It's always money. And at the moment, if you look, for example, demand for credit in South Africa, the increase in money supply, so the fuel for inflation is really increasing at a relatively low rate. I agree with Mike. I think inflation is on its way. I think it can potentially become a big problem in South Africa. But for now, I'm not too concerned about inflation. I think we're probably going to wait a couple of, probably a year or so before. But Mike is absolutely right. There are signs of inflation, including in the rich world. But I'm not too concerned about inflation yet.
Particularly the rich world.
Keep an eye on credit extension and keep an eye on money supply increase.
Just before I come to Bheki, you also add to this particular point. Guys, just to the viewers, it's the last 2 minutes. I'm going to take one more question, but this question was quite important earlier on. I missed it. There are people who have pensions right now, savings right now, who are deeply worried about the state of those savings, of those pensions. Dawie, I must look to you on this question. You know, that person who's worried, what can they do in this moment?
Well, yeah, that's going to be longer than 2 minutes, but let me just point out the risks. Very, very importantly, make sure that take some of your money out. Make sure a substantial portion of your money is invested abroad. And very importantly, make sure your structures are right. Make very sure about your structures. That is a huge, huge problem. People make so many mistakes there. They lose their money, put it in the wrong structures and so on. So those are the two things. Make sure the substantial portion is out and make absolutely 100% sure about the structures. Get a professional to assist you.
Absolutely. I agreed on that particular last point too. Bheki, guys, I'm going to give you all the last word. Bheki, let me begin with you. You can be broad, you can address a specific point, but your last word on this, and of course, how we reach you.
Yeah, so just on the last point, I believe the last point was regarding money printing and inflation. Just to add a little bit to that, I think we should be very wary of the stimulus packages that we saw coming from the West last year. We saw rampant printing of money, rampant of rollout of loan guarantees, massive stimulus package essentially from the United States and other countries. And after that, we saw a rise in stock markets while nominal GDP was remaining flat. I usually use nominal GDP as an indicator of the main street, which is essentially the average individual, the average American or the average South African, and the stock market for the very wealthy, very high income earning individual. And that's shooting quite sky high while the main street is mainly stagnant. And the risk here is that we're going to see large talks of people talking about to print money and essentially give it to the hands of these individuals. And I think that's where we'll see the fuel of inflation come into play. I think we're seeing that with people talking about MMT, modern monetary theorists, talking about that the government can never go bankrupt. It can always print more money to essentially fund its activities. And that's the talk we'll see. We'll see more radicalization of very dangerous ideas that are going come from the left. So that's my closing remark on that. But if you want to reach out to me, our analysis on our YouTube channel, just search the Center for Risk Analysis and you'll see us there.
Excellent. Mpiyakhe, your final word, my brother. Your thoughts on this and how we reach you now? You're on mute, Mpiyakhe.
I was just saying to everyone, get informed, protect yourself and your family, find out what's happening in the global economy, the South African economy, and just do whatever you can to protect yourself, because these are probably going to be the most turbulent times we've had in 60 years or more.
Absolutely. Dawie, I'll come to you. Your final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think, but don't lose hope. We're a regional bunch in South Africa. We can always make a plan. And there are all sort of plans happening in South Africa. But be aware that there's some serious difficulty on its way.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Mike. Final word on the panel.
I think what everybody is saying. Think for yourself. And I enjoyed the panel. I'm afraid we're, however, a little bit of a minority. That's the only thing I'm really worried about.
Yes, man.
That's the sad bit, isn't it? Fellas,
Yeah.
let me say a big thank you to every single one of you. Mpiyakhe, Dhlamini, independent analyst, Bheki, Mahlobo, analyst and researcher at the Center for Risk Analysis, Dawie Roodt, chief economist at the Efficient Group. I'll be popping into your offices, Dawie, to say hi to you and the fellows over there. And Mike Schussler, of course, economist at economist.co.za and at the Brenthurst Group. Guys, thank you so much for being with me on the show.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And with that being said, let me thank you, dear viewer, for being a part of the show as I just clear my guest list over here. Let me thank you, dear viewer, for being a part of the show. Liberty and Friends, of course, will come to you every Sunday here on the BDL show. Please, guys, please, please, please hit that like button whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, and please share this to all of your friends. This is the kind of stuff that I really encourage that you share to your friends so that they can also get in tune, with the arguments and the debate. Oh, excuse me. I think that kombucha and that water is coming back. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching, guys. Please contribute if you can to the show. It really does make a difference. I was out in Waterfall today to shoot the or to film, the Gun Owners South Africa event, Girls on Fire. So I'll bring you that on the Wednesday show of the Big Daddy Liberty show on Wednesday. I'll show you some of the ladies who had fun shooting off some rifles there and some guns as we have that conversation around, what is the best way to empower women in this country, given the high rates of violence against them and gender-based violence in particular. So, guys, thank you so much. This has been Liberty and Friends, another Sunday evening installment. Hopefully, I'm slowly but surely giving carte blanche a run for their money. Thank you guys for the comment section. I really do appreciate it. And of course, as I said, please hit that like button and of course the share button. And a reminder, therefore, as I always end the show, and a reminder to you to never, ever, ever trust a commie.